Good thing we got inside before we got winging wet.
I'm winging in the wane, just winging in the wane.
Hey, did I ever tell you about the time that I rode out a rainstorm underneath a rock?
Under a rock? Ow! Didn't that hurt? I would have gone for a hollow tree.
Oh, silly, the rock wasn't on top of me. It was above me. I was under this rock overhang in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Actually, I'm heading that way later on today. Yoo-hoo! It's an incoming feed from Der Mama.
Mamacita, the Mama Meister, Mama Brother.
Ricky Ticky, the Rickster. Is that thunder I hear?
Well, you know what they say, Mom, into everyone's life a little rain must fall. Looks like you're in a pretty temperate climate, too. From the color of that water, I'd say you are probably a Bahama Mama right now.
Can't fool you, can I? Specifically, I'm on the little isle of San Salvador, where Cristoforo Colombo first landed in 1492. It was right here that he proclaimed the New World open for business.
You think he envisioned subdivisions and shopping malls?
Oh, you betcha. Theme parks, too. He knew the real estate agents were hot on his heels, ready to sell their versions of a new life in the new world. Speaking of a new life, I'm headed for a place that is so poor that many of the people are trying to get to America for a new life, just like the early settlers from Europe did. I'm going to Haiti. Oh, it's a beautiful country, but scenic surroundings don't feed empty stomachs. From there, I'm going down to the bottom of the hemisphere, Tierra del Fuego, where the explorer Ferdinand Magellan first went from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean on the very first voyage around the world. Imagine what it must have been like to go where nobody had ever gone before.
Well, you know, that's exactly what I've been trying to imagine. I've been working on the last part of the GeoQuest, and I think I'm going to call it the human factor, the people of Kentucky's past. Who were they? Where'd they come from? How'd they get here? And why'd they come? What effect did Kentucky's geography have on them? And what effect did they have on Kentucky's geography? And you know what I figured out? It all boils down to a quest for groceries and real estate. Kentucky was a prime piece of land, well stocked with lots of edible goodies. And another thing, those first settlers that came into Kentucky were pretty surprised when they found out it was not uninhabited as they'd been told in the advertising back in Virginia and Carolina.
So the New World wasn't new.
Well, no, not to those Native Americans and their ancestors who'd already been here for 10,000 years.
Well, I guess that's long enough to call a place home. And what's Ricky going to be shooting with the Cardinal Cam?
Well, I want our little eye in the sky guy to document the main routes that the settlers used coming into Kentucky. So he'll have to get some shots of the Cumberland Gap and the Wilderness Road. And then he'll need to shoot some more footage of the Ohio River, upriver from Maysville maybe, and then down near Louisville. I'm going to get some footage of a rock shelter where Daniel Boone himself may have stayed when he was exploring Kentucky. After that, I'm going to make a couple of stops in central Kentucky near the site of a Shawnee settlement. And I hope to get down to Danville, where Kentucky became a state. Ricky's going to report back from the falls of the Ohio in Louisville, our largest city, which grew up on a riverbank near the falls. Then he'll get some footage of the Belle of Louisville, an old-time paddle wheel steamboat. It was the invention of the steamboat that really led to the growth of our river towns.
Well, we both have busy itineraries. You better get on your boat, and I've got to catch my plane.
Good luck with your explorations, Mom.
Oh, you too, dear. Toodaloo!
Toodaloo. All right, Flyboy, bring it down over here somewhere and let me give you a background briefing.
Planes? Who needs them?
Now, Ricky, you about threw my neck out of joint. Come on now, settle down over here. We've got a lot of work to do. We're looking for evidence of the human factor in Kentucky.
Sounds like serious business. A few humanoids can make a mess out of Mother Nature.
We're going to trace Kentucky's original inhabitants. We have to go back about 17,000 years ago, when a series of ice ages pushed these giant glaciers way down into the North American continent. This forced great herds of prehistoric animals to migrate southward. And the ice grew so much that it shrank the oceans, which caused a series of islands in the North Pacific to turn into a land bridge, linking the Americas with the Asian continent. Thousands of years later, prehistoric or paleo people, paleo meaning ancient, walked across that land bridge out of Asia and into North America. And it probably took these people hundreds or even thousands of years to make their way into what is now Kentucky. And the big attraction around here was a salt lick up in northern Kentucky, which attracted herds of woolly mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and bison, and a variety of smaller animals, all guaranteed to satisfy those ancient munchies. Here, let me call up some footage that I shot at Big Bone Lick. It's a state park just southwest of Covington. The bones of 22 species of extinct prehistoric mammals were found there. Ben Franklin studied some of the bones from Big Bone Lick, and Thomas Jefferson ordered the place excavated for scientific study. Many of the bones ended up in museums in England. Scientists say the mammoths, mastodon, bison, and company came here for salt, an important mineral for all of us mammals. And a bunch of those big guys got stuck in the boggy land around the lick and died. That's why they call it Big Bone Lick. So, we know that there were animals here in Kentucky thousands of years ago, but how do we know there were people? I'll give you a couple of answers to that. First, here's some footage I shot when I was in Mammoth Cave, where they found this 4,000-year-old slipper.
Wow! So that's the great-great-great-granddaddy of the sneaker!
Now I want to show you evidence of a different kind of Indian culture. While a lot of the early Native Americans were nomadic hunters and gatherers, meaning that they followed the herds of animals from one place to another, there were also permanent Indian settlements. One of the most impressive sites is the Wickliffe Mounds on the Mississippi River in western Kentucky. This was a thriving Native American town about 900 years ago. The people lived on and around these mounds, and they raised crops like corn and beans in the fertile bottomlands along the river. So they were pretty well settled in. The reason we know so much about those mound builders is because of careful excavation and study by scientists. Let me show you an example of what can happen when greedy, untrained people dig up ancient sites to rob them of their artifacts. This is footage of Slack Farm in Union County. It was a late prehistoric town of Indians who made beautiful beads and pottery. It was left looking like a lunar landscape in 1988 when 10 men looted the place, destroying priceless information in the process. Now, these grave robbers were convicted of a minor offense, but at least their convictions helped bring about tougher new laws. Okay, enough briefing. Let's get out there and commune with Boone.
Yippee-yi-ki-yay!
Actually, Daniel Boone didn't wear a coonskin cap. Davy Crockett maybe, but not Daniel Boone.
I lose this cap in the name of accuracy.
Oh, wait a minute. Let's be sure and take our token artifact. You know, Cecil Isom may be able to tell us just how old this is. mind-boggling to think about it, but there were people living here in Kentucky thousands of years before there was a Kentucky. Way before Daniel Boone, Thomas Walker, James Herod, and Simon Kenton. Long before DeSoto and LaSalle and all the other Euro-Americans who came and claimed all or parts of Kentucky for their countries or themselves. The Native Americans who were here before us didn't believe in individual ownership of the land. To them, Mother Earth was like the sun or the sky. It was a powerful natural force, not something that you could buy or possess. It was a gift to be shared. And this rock shelter is a good example of how some of the early inhabitants made use of one of Kentucky's distinctive geographic features. And this is where we're going to meet Cecil Isom, an archaeologist with the National Forest Service. So how do we know that people actually lived here 1,000 years ago, Cecil?
Well, as archaeologists, we're constantly looking for clues to the past. And in this shelter, for example, we find bits and pieces of pottery, such as this, a potsherd. It's like putting together a large jigsaw puzzle. By putting these pieces together, we end up with something like this. So we know the type of pottery that the Indians were using to cook their foods in. And if you look inside, you can still see the beams.
Well, beams still there. Wow, that's neat.
Another thing we look for are the arrowheads, similar to this one.
And you find those just around in shelters like this.
Just as the Indians left them.
Wow, that's interesting. But why would anybody ever want to live under a rock?
Well, like today, it's rainy, dreary outside. Here we are, nice and dry and comfortable. It was a ready-made house. The Indians lived here for thousands of years. And when the pioneers came in, they lived in rock shelters similar to this before they could build their log cabins.
And we think that Daniel Boone might have actually stayed in this shelter?
It's quite possible that Daniel himself lived in this shelter here, or one very similar to this. He was known to have lived in this area.
Gosh, that's exciting. And that's part of why this area is called the Daniel Boone National Forest, huh? So you explored this area.
Another reason that people would like to live in these rock shelters is that food was nearby. For example, this Indian cucumber root. Walk right out to your doorstep and you can have a salad.
Wow. Well, that's exciting and interesting. I did have one other thing I wanted to ask you, though, Cecil, because I found this in my garden at home. And I wondered if you could tell me if it's real, if somebody made it long ago, and maybe when.
It looks like an arrowhead that was made by the Kirk people who lived here in Kentucky about 8,000 years ago. Wow. And we tell that by the craftsmanship along the edge of the arrowhead. Arrowheads were like cars. They would change through time, different makes and different models.
So you determine what age it is by the way it's made and the way it's cut, just like a car. That's great. That's exciting. In my own backyard, something that's 8,000 years old.
A great trace of the past.
I tell you. Okay, I'm here in Clark County with archaeologist Gwen Henderson, who's going to tell us about one of the last Indian settlements in Kentucky, the I can't say it, Gwen, you say it.
Esquipakathiki.
Esquipakathiki.
That's right.
Okay.
Esquipakathiki. It was an Indian village in Clark County, situated in a place not too different from what you see in back of me here. Esquipakathiki means in Shawnee blue lick or blue spring, and we know very little about the town actually because archaeologists haven't been able to find much, and there aren't many documents that describe it. There are documents, and archaeologists have found a lot of evidence of a similar Shawnee town called Lower Shawnee Town in Greenup County. It was a large Indian village. It had probably 1,000 people or more in it. Shawnee and Iroquois lived there. English and French traders came there, and it had a council house with bark covering and lots of houses. It was a large and important trading center.
Were there other towns in the area also?
Town isn't really a good word, I don't think. Village is good, or camp. Archaeologists have also found quarries and Indian salt-making sites, and they've also found Indian burial grounds or cemeteries, some of which were built in mounds. And this mound here is a burial mound. It was built by a group of people that we call Adina, although that's not exactly what they called themselves. We don't know what they called themselves. They built the mound by burying their dead in log tombs and then covering the tombs over with soil. And as more and more leaders were buried there, the mounds became bigger and bigger, till you see something like this.
And why is it, Gwen, that when the European settlers came, they thought that Kentucky was going to be unoccupied?
That's a good question, Molly, and I'm glad you've asked it, because it's a misunderstanding. It's a myth that needs to be cleared up. And I think part of the myth is due to a misunderstanding of the way the Indians lived, their way of life, but also an advertising ploy. It's easier to have people come to a place and build a new life and new houses if they think that the place is unoccupied, free, and open for settlement. The misunderstanding about their culture comes from not knowing that they lived in villages in the summer, and then in the winter and early spring moved to hunting camps. So if they saw hunters, they would think that there wasn't anybody living there. And so that's how I think part of it came about.
That's interesting. Thanks so much, Gwen. We appreciate your time.
Great.
Thanks. All right. That's good. So, when the first white men and women came here, there were Shawnee, Cherokee, Wyandotte, and Chickasaw. And then more and more and more people poured in through the Cumberland Gap and followed animal trails and Indian trails in search of new land. Cumberland Gap, that reminds me, I better check in with Ricky. Ricky? Ricky, do you read me?
Roger, Molly. This is your roving redbird reporting. I'm cruising over what was once the main entrance into Kentucky, the Cumberland Gap. From this birdacious vantage point, the gap looks like a notch carved out of Cumberland Mountain. It's the only natural break in the rocky barrier that had kept pioneer families confined to the eastern edge of America. But once the trail was blazed by Thomas Walker, Daniel Boone, and others, more than 200,000 new settlers passed through here in a 50-year period. Nowadays, there's a modern highway that passes through the gap, with thousands of people traveling on it every day. A tunnel's going to reroute the road right through the mountain, and the gap will be restored to a narrow footpath like it was 250 years ago. Then, people will be able to hike in the footsteps of the early settlers and the Native Americans who passed through here years ago. This was the route of the Wilderness Road, through the Cumberland Gap and on towards Flat Lick, then on to Crab Orchard. The road ran north of present-day Barberville towards London. At Hazel Patch in Laurel County, Daniel Boone broke off the old trail and cut a new one north to the Kentucky River,
where he established Fort Boone. Well, actually, this is a replica, Fort Boonesboro behind me. Site of the original fort's down closer to the river. And do you know, on the way to this location, Boone and his axemen were attacked by Indians, and 3 of the men were killed. When they got here, they went right to work surveying plots of land for themselves. But the leader of the settlement, Judge Richard Henderson, arrived soon after and convinced the group to go ahead and build a stockade. It was a good thing, too, because the Native Americans were desperate to stop the incoming tide of settlers. There would be all-out attacks that would last for days on end. Oh, gosh. It's time for me to go, Ricky. I got to meet Nancy O'Malley. She's an archaeologist who's done a lot of research on Boonesboro. I'll see you soon, okay? Bye. So, Nancy, why did the settlers choose this spot for Fort Boonesboro?
This was a really good spot for a fort. It was right on a major river, the Kentucky River, and so you could go up and down the river in canoes. It was on a big open area, grassy area along the river, so it didn't have a lot of trees that had to be cut down and cleared. It also was right next to a creek that had fresh water and mineral water springs issuing into it. And the fresh water, of course, was for drinking, and the mineral water was used as a medicine. So there was a lot of good reasons to stop here.
What must it have been like to live here during that time?
I think it must have been pretty scary a lot of the time, because Boonesboro was settled around the time of the Revolutionary War. And the British, who the settlers were fighting, had armed the Indians, and the Indians came down and attacked Kentucky settlers. So there was always the threat of Indians. But at the same time, they were also here to start a new life. They were finding farm lands to settle, building houses, putting in crops, and then periodically having to come back to the fort for safety reasons.
It's a pretty scary time, but also hopeful about new beginnings.
Yes, and they were a very brave bunch too.
Must have been, yes. So why was Boonesboro such an important place during that time?
Well, when you came into Kentucky on the Wilderness Trail through the Cumberland Gap, Fort Boonesboro was the first really large fort that you would come to. There were other stopping places along the way, but this was where you had a chance to sit down, catch your breath, catch up with family members who might have come before, find out where the land was available for farming, perhaps trade for food, get mail, and also be safe from Indian attack as well.
Sort of a rest stop.
Yeah.
Information center and haven from the Indians.
That's right.
Yes. So what finally happened to Fort Boonesboro?
Well, after the Revolutionary War, of course, we didn't need forts to protect us. Indians retreated back up into Ohio, and everyone got down to the serious business of establishing their homes. They tried to start a town here, but that didn't take off very well. A few houses got built, a couple of tobacco warehouses were erected, but within about 30 years, you could hardly even tell a town had ever been here.
That's amazing. Well, I'd like to look around the fort a little more if you'd show me around. And thanks for all your help.
Thanks.
After the American Revolution, the Kentucky territories became part of the state of Virginia. But the same mountains that had long prevented immigration from the east also made for slow government action from the other side of the mountains. In these buildings here in Danville's Constitution Square, the push for statehood took shape. It took 8 years and what must have been a very long-winded series of 10 meetings. They called them constitutional conventions before the U.S. Congress accepted Kentucky's request to be the 15th state in the Union. So, in a big way, geography led to our statehood. It also led to the creation of a great quantity of counties. Kentucky now has 120 of them. That's because when they were laying things out, Kentucky's founding fathers wanted people to have a local seat of government within a day's ride. That way more people would have access to the government, and the government would have access to more taxpayers. The Euro-American settlers brought with them to Boonesboro and the rest of Kentucky their version of a cruel and inhumane practice. And I'm talking about the practice of slavery and the roots of it that lie in racism. This is footage of Cheapside Street in Lexington on the west side of the Fayette County Courthouse. You wouldn't know it to look at it, but it was the site of one of the biggest slave auctions in Kentucky. The black population in Kentucky is now about 7%, but in the mid-1800s, half of Lexington's population were slaves. And on this very spot, families were torn apart to satisfy the Deep South's need for labor to work in the cotton fields. Husbands and wives and their children were separated and sold like livestock. And while this was a major slave market, there was also a strong anti-slavery movement here. Henry Clay himself, a slave owner, wanted them freed gradually and returned to Africa. His younger cousin, Cassius Clay, wanted to abolish slavery immediately and completely. His abolitionist newspaper, the Lexington True American, was so controversial that a mob broke into the paper's office, dismantled the press, and shipped it to Cincinnati. Some slaves escaped through the so-called Underground Railroad, traveling by night and being hidden by conductors along the way to Ohio and freedom. Two of Kentucky's most famous fugitive slaves were Henry Bibb and Josiah Henson. Both men later wrote about their lives in slavery. Henson is said to have been the model for the main character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is set in Kentucky. And that's the book that inspired Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which proclaimed an end to slavery. Now it's about time for a Ricky report. He should be on the Ohio River on his way to Louisville. Ricky? Ricky on the river, do you read me?
This is Ricky Redbird reporting. What you're seeing here is the other main route into Kentucky, the Ohio River. Christopher Gist was one of the first pioneer explorers to come down the Ohio, and James Herod came this way and then went up the Kentucky River to found Herodstown, the very first town in Kentucky. A lot of the settlers who followed the early explorers came downriver from Pennsylvania, and they might have gone all the way down the Ohio to the Mississippi and on to New Orleans, but for one thing, a geographic feature called the Falls of the Ohio. The falls is a shallow, rocky place in the river where boats couldn't pass. It was the only spot between Pittsburgh and New Orleans where the geography stopped river traffic. So travelers and freight going in either direction had to stop here and go overland around the falls.
So geography had a lot to do with the birth of our largest city, Louisville. It was a natural place for a town to spring up. Since boats had to be unloaded and their cargo carried by wagon around the falls, there was a need for shipping companies, warehouses, and wholesalers, not to mention inns and taverns to serve the river trade.
Molly, this is the Belle of Louisville, an old-time paddle wheel steamboat. Wow, look at her go!
More than anything else, it was the invention of the steamboat that led to the development of our river towns. Thanks to the steamboat, rivers became the superhighways of the 1800s, but we got to move on to planes, trains, and automobiles. We got to see how those Kentuckians of modern days and their machines are interacting with the landscape. It'll be the last chapter of the book.
What are you going to call it? My new Kentucky home?
Hey, that's pretty good. I like it. And there it is, right now, over your shoulder.
Whoa, I believe you're right.